The square was already crowded when they forced her down. Boots circled in a rough half-ring, dust lifting with every shift of weight as soldiers and camp workers leaned in to witness the accusation unfold. Someone had shoved her forward hard enough that her knees struck the packed earth, and the impact sent a sharp jolt up her spine. "On your knees!" a guard barked again, though she was already there, hands pressed to the ground to steady herself. The charge was read aloud from a folded paper. Enemy coordination, signal interference, leaked convoy positions. The words carried through the open air, like a verdict already decided. A murmur rippled outward, some voices angry, others uneasy, but none loud enough to challenge what was happening. She lifted her head despite the guard's hand pushing it down. Beyond the ring of uniforms, the trucks idled near the far gate, another convoy preparing to depart before nightfall. Timing mattered. That was why this moment felt wrong. "You were seen near the ridgeline with a signal lamp," the guard continued, reading stiffly. She swallowed dust and answered without pleading. "I was counting transmissions. The signals weren't ours." Laughter broke from somewhere in the crowd. "Convenient," a soldier muttered. The guard reached for her shoulder to force her lower again, but the sound of a vehicle door slamming cut through the tension. Conversations faltered as the colonel crossed the square, coat unbuttoned, expression unreadable. He did not rush. He did not shout. He stopped just short of the circle and looked first at the paper in the guard's hand, then at her kneeling form. "Who authorized this?" he asked quietly. The guard stiffened. "Sir, intelligence report from signal station, signed and sealed." The colonel held out his hand. The paper was passed over. He scanned it once, eyes narrowing at the seal's placement and the rushed signature line. Around him, the murmuring began to slow. She spoke before he could turn away. "They're preparing a second strike," she said, voice steady despite dust clinging to her lips. "The first convoy reroute exposed one cell. This one is larger." The guard scoffed, but the colonel did not. "What proof?" he asked, tone measured. "The transmission pattern repeats every 9 minutes," she replied. And it started again at dawn. A horn blared from the convoy line, signaling readiness to move. The colonel looked toward the trucks, then back at the kneeling figure before him. "Stand her up," he ordered calmly. The guard hesitated, but the colonel's gaze held firm. "We do not convict on noise," he added. The circle shifted, tension giving way to uncertainty. The colonel faced the crowd fully now. "Evidence," he said, voice carrying across the square. "Bring me evidence, or this ends here." The square fell into an uneasy silence as she rose slowly from her knees, dusted and accused, but no longer bowed. The field office sat just off the square, its wooden shutters half open to the afternoon light. The air inside thick with ink, dust, and tension carried in from the crowd. The colonel entered first, placing the accusation report flat on the central desk, while the nurse followed under guard, not restrained, but watched closely. The guard closed the door behind them, muting the murmurs outside. "Read it again," the colonel said to the adjutant standing near the filing cabinet. The adjutant cleared his throat and began reciting the intelligence summary. Observed signal activity near the ridge, unidentified light patterns, suspected coordination with hostile scouts. The colonel listened without interruption, but his gaze remained fixed on the seal, pressed at the bottom of the page. It sat slightly off-center, but the ink darker than the surrounding typewritten text. "When was this filed?" he asked. "This morning, sir. Just before assembly," the adjutant replied. The nurse stepped closer to the desk. "The transmission window they referenced was last night," she said. "Yet the report was sealed before dawn," the adjutant frowned. "The signal logs confirm unusual activity." The colonel reached for the logbook stacked beneath the report and flipped through the pages. The timestamps were neat but crowded, some entries squeezed between margins. He tapped one line with his finger. "This entry overlaps the previous one. The adjutant leaned in. Clerical error, perhaps. Or alteration, the nurse replied calmly. She pointed to the handwriting of the last 3 entries. Different pressure on the pen. The strokes are sharper. The colonel compared the signatures. The earlier entries were smooth and rounded, the later ones jagged and hurried. He lifted the page slightly toward the light, revealing faint indentations beneath the surface, marks of overwritten lines. "Who handled the log after midnight?" he asked. The adjutant hesitated. "Signal Officer Weber, sir." The colonel closed the book slowly. Outside, the faint hum of convoy engines continued, a reminder that decisions were not suspended, simply because doubt had entered the room. "Bring Weber," the colonel ordered. The guard stepped out swiftly. Silence settled for a moment between the colonel and the nurse. "You're certain about the 9-minute pattern?" he asked without looking up. "Yes, sir," she replied. "It aligns with the gap in the altered timestamps." The door reopened, and Weber entered, posture rigid, but eyes unsettled. "You signed this report," the colonel said, sliding the paper across the desk. Weber nodded. "Yes, sir." "Explain the overlapping entries." Weber swallowed. "Radio interference distorted earlier notes. I rewrote them." The colonel's expression did not change. "Then why is the seal ink fresh while the type ribbon shows wear?" Weber's gaze flickered briefly toward the nurse before returning to the desk. The silence in the room thickened. Outside, another horn sounded from the yard, urging departure. The colonel folded the report deliberately. "Until I see unaltered transmission logs, no punishment proceeds," he said evenly. He looked at the nurse. "And no convoy leaves this camp on a report I cannot verify." The tension shifted from accusation to investigation. The sealed report that had nearly condemned her now sat exposed on the desk, its inconsistencies heavier than its words. The signal station stood behind the administrative barracks, a narrow wooden structure reinforced with sandbags along its base and antenna wires stretching upward into the pale sky. Inside, the air vibrated faintly with the hum of equipment and the intermittent crackle of static. The colonel entered without announcement, Weber following under guard, and the nurse stepped in last, eyes immediately scanning the row of transmission logs stacked beside the radio console. The operator straightened nervously as boots crossed the floorboards. "All logs since midnight," the colonel ordered. The operator pulled a ledger from beneath the desk and placed it on the table. The nurse opened it without hesitation, flipping back to the page corresponding to the alleged signal window. Columns of timestamps ran down the left margin, night call signs and notes scribbled beside each entry. "There," she said, tapping a line marked 217. "The 9-minute spacing begins here." The colonel leaned closer. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. 217, 226, 235, 244. Each entry noted faint light activity near the ridge. "If this were genuine observation," she continued, "the intervals would vary. No human signaler maintains perfect repetition under field conditions." Weber shifted uncomfortably. "It could be automated flare reflection," he suggested weakly. The nurse shook her head. "Not with this intensity fluctuation." She pointed to the margins where tiny marks indicated signal strength. "The signal strength decreases slightly every third interval. That suggests pre-recorded relay interference, not live communication." The colonel studied the ink again. The first half of the page bore steady handwriting. The latter half tightened, letters compressed as though written in haste. "Why are these margins uneven?" he asked the operator. The man hesitated. "We received interference, sir. I rewrote the notes to clarify." The colonel pressed a fingertip against the paper, feeling the indentation beneath the rewritten lines. "You rewrote over-erased entries." The operator's silence confirmed more than his words. Outside the station, the low rumble of trucks still waiting at the yard carried faintly through the walls. Time was narrowing. The nurse turned toward the radio equipment itself. "May I?" she asked. The colonel nodded. She adjusted the frequency dial to the secondary reserve channel, then to the primary frequency used during the alleged signal window. A faint clicking rhythm emerged beneath the static. Too regular, too precise. "That's not field noise," she said. "It's looped interference." The colonel motioned to a technician. "Trace it." The technician connected a secondary receiver and began triangulating direction. After several tense seconds, he looked up. "Signal origin isn't the ridge, sir. It's coming from within camp perimeter." Weber's composure fractured. "That's impossible," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The colonel stepped closer, gaze sharp. "Within perimeter where?" The technician adjusted the dial once more. "Near storage sheds behind the depot." The nurse met the colonel's eyes. "That's where the convoy loading begins." The pieces aligned with chilling clarity. Falsified timestamps, altered route, de-staged signal interference to frame her and justify rerouting the convoy into danger. The colonel straightened. "Seal the sheds," he ordered. "No one enters or leaves." Weber tried to step back, but two guards closed in on him instantly. The colonel turned toward the door. "We verify this now," he said firmly. As they exited the signal station, the steady pulse of false transmissions continued behind them, a mechanical echo of deception that had nearly condemned an innocent woman and sent a convoy into an ambush. The storage sheds behind the depot stood in a narrow row of corrugated metal structures, their doors half open to allow ventilation for fuel drums and supply crates stacked inside. As the colonel approached with two armed guards, soldiers already stationed nearby straightened uneasily, sensing the shift from suspicion to investigation. The nurse followed closely, her attention fixed on the small radio antenna barely visible behind the third shed, disguised between stacked wooden pallets. "That wasn't there last week," she said quietly. The colonel gave a brief nod. "Secure the perimeter." Guards fanned outward, blocking exits and scanning the yard. The convoy engines beyond the gate continued to idle, waiting for final clearance. Inside the first shed, crates were stacked with meticulous labeling: medical supplies, ammunition, field rations. The nurse moved through them quickly, checking seals and ink stamps. "These are intact," she said. In the second shed, however, several crates near the back wall bore fresh markings, darker than the others. The colonel crouched beside one and pried open the lid with the butt of his pistol. Beneath a thin layer of medical gauze lay tightly packed signal transmitters wired to small, timed ignition devices. "Portable interference units," the lieutenant muttered, lifting one carefully. "Enough to distort radio channels within range." The nurse stepped toward the third shed, drawn to the faint clicking sound that matched what she had heard in the signal station. Inside, tucked behind a row of fuel drums, a compact transmitter hummed steadily, connected to a makeshift power source spliced from depot wiring. "That's your origin," she said. The colonel examined the wiring, noting the crude but effective setup. "Who has access to this shed?" he asked sharply. A junior quartermaster swallowed. "Only logistics officers and signal staff, sir." Weber, escorted under guard, avoided looking at the equipment. The colonel's voice lowered but sharpened. "You altered the logs and staged interference to validate the false charge." Weber's composure finally broke. "The convoy was never meant to survive," he snapped, desperation bleeding through. "The timber crossing would have stalled them long enough for—" He stopped himself, realizing too late what he had admitted. The nurse stepped back as soldiers seized Weber's arms. Outside, the tension in the yard shifted again as word spread that sabotage had been uncovered. The colonel turned to the depot's master manifest pinned near the entrance. Several fuel allocations had been redirected to the timber crossing route, ensuring maximum vulnerability. "It wasn't just a frame-up," the lieutenant said quietly. "It was coordinated destruction." The colonel nodded. "And nearly executed." He looked toward the convoy lined up at the gate, drivers unaware how close they had come to catastrophe. "Clear every shed," he ordered. "Confiscate all unauthorized transmitters." Soldiers moved swiftly, dismantling the hidden antenna and securing the devices. The nurse stood still for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had nearly unfolded. Public humiliation masking operational sabotage. The colonel stepped beside her. "You recognize the pattern," he said evenly. She did not answer immediately. "Because it repeated," she replied. "Deception leaves repetition." Outside, the convoy commander approached, awaiting instruction. The colonel squared his shoulders. "Prepare the column for departure," he said. "We reroute and double escort." The sheds, once silent witnesses to concealed betrayal, now stood exposed under armed guard as the camp shifted from suspicion to decisive action. The officers' mess buzzed with restrained tension as word of the exposed transmitters spread across the camp. Yet discipline demanded outward composure, even as suspicion fractured old assumptions. The colonel stood at the center of a long wooden table, while senior officers gathered around him, their expressions split between relief and unease. Some had publicly supported the accusation in the square only hours earlier, and the memory of her kneeling form still lingered, uncomfortably in the air. "Sabotage has been confirmed," the colonel stated evenly, placing the recovered transmitter on the table so its wires lay exposed beneath the lantern light. "However, the convoy remains delayed, and headquarters expects delivery before nightfall." A major cleared his throat. "Sir, halting the convoy twice in one day could be viewed as hesitation. We have already corrected the route." The colonel's gaze did not waver. "We corrected one route. That does not guarantee no second attempt." Outside, the rumble of engines continued, steady but impatient, echoing through the thin wooden walls. The nurse stood near the doorway under guard escort, allowed inside at the colonel's discretion. She listened quietly as the debate intensified. "The men need confidence," another officer argued. "Public doubt undermines authority." The colonel responded calmly. "Blind confidence undermines survival." The room fell silent. He turned toward her. "You mentioned the pattern extended beyond the ridge signals. Explain." She stepped forward, placing a folded scrap of paper onto the table. "The 9-minute signal intervals align with transport shift rotations. Each altered transmission coincided with guard change near the supply yard." A captain frowned. "You're suggesting additional collaborators," she nodded. "Not necessarily willing ones, but the pattern allowed equipment to be moved unnoticed." The colonel studied the timing notes she had drawn in careful strokes. The alignment was precise, too precise to ignore. "If another attempt is made," she continued, "it will exploit the same shift window." The major shook his head. "Speculation." The colonel looked at him sharply. "Speculation is what tied her to that post." The reminder silenced further protest. He straightened. "We move the convoy, but under modified protocol." He outlined the plan swiftly. Staggered departure, reinforced escort, altered timing outside normal rotation, and advanced scouts positioned earlier than standard procedure. The nurse added one final observation. "If the saboteurs believe discipline has resumed without change, they may reveal themselves when nothing detonates." The colonel nodded once. "Then we give them that illusion." Outside the mess hall, soldiers formed new escort units, while mechanics rechecked fuel lines and axle bolts. Doubt had not vanished, but it had shifted direction, from suspicion of her to suspicion of hidden enemies within their ranks. As the colonel exited the room, officers followed in tighter formation than before, their earlier objections replaced by silent acceptance. The nurse paused at the doorway, glancing toward the square where she had knelt hours earlier. The rope was gone, the post bare, yet the memory of that public humiliation now carried a different weight. It had not ended in punishment, but in exposure. Engines revved as the convoy prepared once more. This time, not under blind routine, but under calculated vigilance shaped by the very warning once dismissed. The convoy assembly point churned with controlled urgency as trucks were repositioned under the colonel's revised protocol, headlights briefly flickering on and off, while mechanics finalized checks under fading daylight. The nurse stood beside the operations board mounted near the gate, tracing the new departure intervals marked in chalk. The original schedule had been precise and predictable. This one, staggered movement in uneven gaps, disrupting the 9-minute rhythm that had enabled interference earlier. The colonel addressed the convoy commander directly. First unit departs in 4 minutes. Second unit holds for 11. Third unit waits 17. The commander blinked. Unorthodox timing, sir. The colonel replied evenly. Unorthodox survival. Scouts were dispatched ahead of the column. She instructed to maintain radio silence unless direct engagement occurred. The nurse adjusted her watch, counting silently. If the saboteurs were monitoring for routine intervals, the broken cadence would expose confusion. A lieutenant approached, whispering that several enlisted men from the previous shift had requested reassignment away from the convoy detail. The colonel's expression hardened. "Keep them visible," he ordered. "No one leaves post until departure is complete." The first truck rolled forward, tires crunching against gravel as it exited the gate under armed escort. The second truck remained stationary longer than usual, creating visible tension among drivers accustomed to synchronized departure. Beyond the perimeter fence, dusk settled across the road, leading toward the ridge and the alternate crossing. The nurse watched the guard tower clocks tick unevenly against the revised schedule. At exactly 9 minutes past the first departure, no interference crackled through the radios. At 18 minutes, still nothing. The colonel exchanged a brief glance with her. "They're waiting," she murmured. "For the pattern." The third truck suddenly lurched forward earlier than its assigned time, the driver claiming miscommunication. The colonel raised a hand sharply. "Hold that vehicle!" Soldiers surrounded the truck before it cleared the yard. Under inspection, an extra fuel drum was discovered wedged behind standard cargo, its cap loosely sealed and wired internally. The lieutenant exhaled sharply. "Secondary ignition source." The colonel turned toward the assembled officers. "The attempt shifts with the pattern." The nurse stepped closer to the halted truck. "If it detonated en route, they would blame mechanical failure." The colonel addressed the drivers. "Resume departure under revised timing. No deviations." The halted vehicle was removed from rotation, its driver detained for questioning. As the final truck cleared the gate under staggered intervals, a radio burst cracked faintly through the secondary channel, an attempt to re-establish interference that failed to sync with the altered convoy rhythm. The technician monitoring the channel looked up. "Signal attempt misaligned, sir." The colonel nodded once. "They miscalculated." The convoy moved beyond the camp perimeter in uneven formation, frustrating any preset ambush timing along the ridge road. The nurse stood still as dust settled behind the last truck. "They expected discipline to be predictable," she said quietly. The colonel responded without looking away from the road. "Discipline adapts." The assembly yard, once the stage of her humiliation, now bore witness to calculated control. The broken rhythm had not only prevented another ignition attempt, but forced the saboteurs into exposure. With the convoy advancing under revised strategy and guards tightening internal security, the camp shifted from reactive defense to deliberate countermeasure. The ridge road narrowed as it curved toward the timber crossing, dusk settling into long shadows that stretched across the gravel like silent warnings. The lead scout vehicle slowed, headlights dimmed, its driver scanning the tree line where the earlier ambush had been planned. The convoy followed under the colonel's staggered formation, distances uneven, engines steady, but alert. The nurse rode in the second vehicle beside a radio operator, headset pressed lightly against her ear as she listened for irregular bursts of static. The altered timing had unsettled the enemy's coordination, But that did not guarantee retreat. A sudden flicker of light flashed near the original ambush point. Brief. Misplaced. Searching. "They're trying to reacquire," she said quietly. The operator relayed the observation forward. The colonel, owner positioned in the third truck, ordered a halt just short of the ridge bend. Soldiers dismounted quickly, spreading along the embankment under cover of sparse brush. The broken rhythm of the convoy now worked in their favor. No synchronized cluster of trucks created a single, vulnerable target. Another faint click pulsed through the radio, misaligned and desperate. Then came the first rifle crack from high ground. Dirt erupted near the lead vehicle, but the staggered spacing left no concentrated impact zone. "Flank left!" the colonel commanded. Two squads advanced along the lower slope, using the ridge's uneven terrain to shield their movement. The nurse crouched beside the second truck, scanning the hillside where muzzle flashes betrayed concealed shooters. She noticed something unusual. Movement not toward the convoy, but backward along the ridge. "They're retreating early," she warned. "They expected the detonation to do the damage." The colonel seized the moment. "Advance pressure. Force surrender." Soldiers moved swiftly, controlled bursts of return fire driving the attackers from their positions. Smoke drifted between trees as one saboteur attempted to ignite a backup device buried near the roadside, only to find the timing window already passed. The altered convoy intervals had disrupted the trigger sequence completely. Within minutes, the ambush line collapsed. Several attackers dropped their weapons. Others captured while attempting to flee toward the timber crossing. A lieutenant recovered a small transmitter unit discarded near a tree stump, its wiring scorched from failed activation. "Timed for synchronized convoy grouping," he reported, though the colonel looked toward the nurse. "Broken rhythm," he said. She nodded once. "And broken assumption." The ridge fell quiet except for the hum of engines idling in the uneven cadence. Soldiers secured the area, checking for secondary devices along the gravel path. The convoy commander approached the colonel. "Minimal casualties, no vehicle damage." The nurse exhaled slowly, the weight of hours pressing against her shoulders. The square where she had knelt felt distant now, replaced by the ridge where calculated doubt had saved lives. The colonel addressed the assembled troops briefly. "The ambush failed because discipline adapted. Remember that." No cheers erupted. Only firm nods and renewed alertness as the convoy prepared to resume movement. Dusk deepened, but the road ahead remained clear. The staggered formation rolled forward again, the engines steady, no longer prey to predictable timing. Behind them, captured saboteurs were escorted under guard, proof that false accusation had nearly concealed a larger betrayal. The ridge, once intended as a trap, now stood as evidence that strategy and restraint had prevailed. The camp square filled again before sunset, but this time the air carried no shouting, no jeering, no rushed judgment. Soldiers assembled in ordered lines, boots aligned, rifles resting at identical angles against shoulders. Civilians from the nearby quarter gathered at the edges, drawn by word of the failed ambush, and captured saboteurs being escorted back through the gates. The same wooden post still stood at the center of the yard, bare now, the rope removed earlier that afternoon. The nurse walked across the open ground under formal escort, not restrained, not guarded from harm, but present as witness. The colonel stepped onto the raised platform near the flagpole, documents in hand, his presence commanding immediate silence. The captured attackers were positioned nearby under armed watch, faces hardened but defeated. The colonel did not begin with accusation. He began with evidence. "This afternoon," he said evenly, "a convoy departed under altered protocol." He lifted the recovered transmitter unit, wires exposed, its metal casing scratched from hurried concealment. "These devices were timed to detonate upon synchronized grouping." Murmurs flickered through the formation. He continued. "The forged signal logs, altered route orders, and planted interference were intended to validate a false charge." The square held its breath. He unfolded the sealed report that had once justified her public humiliation and held it high. The seal was falsified, the timestamps altered, the witness statement fabricated. His voice remained calm, not dramatic but firm. He turned toward the nurse who stood upright in the center of the square, where she had knelt earlier. "You were forced down before this crowd without verified proof." No one shifted. No one whispered. The weight of that statement pressed against every witness present. "Your warning exposed coordinated sabotage," he continued. "Your analysis prevented destruction." The colonel then faced the assembled soldiers fully. Discipline does not mean obedience without question. Discipline means responsibility to truth. A long silence followed. Not the restless kind from earlier in the day, but deliberate and reflective. The lieutenant stepped forward and removed his cap briefly in acknowledgement before replacing it with crisp precision. One by one, others followed, a restrained gesture of respect rather than spectacle. The nurse remained composed, her posture unchanged, gaze steady. The colonel stepped down from the platform and walked toward the wooden post. Without ceremony, he ordered it removed. Two soldiers dismantled it swiftly, carrying the timber away from the square entirely. The symbol of accusation vanished as quickly as it had been erected. Engines from the departing convoy echoed faintly beyond the gate, steady and unthreatened. The square, once a stage for humiliation, now stood quiet under the fading light. No applause followed, no theatrical declaration, only a restored order grounded in fact rather than fear. As formation dismissed under command, the colonel paused briefly beside her. "Truth stands," he said quietly. She answered simply, "Because you required it." The square emptied slowly, leaving behind only the memory of silence that had replaced accusation. Months later, the Ridge Road had become one of the most secure supply corridors in the sector, reinforced by additional patrols and revised convoy protocols born from that single disrupted ambush. Reports filed at headquarters cited the incident as a turning point in internal security doctrine, emphasizing verification over assumption and adaptive timing over rigid routine. The camp square no longer bore any trace of the wooden post that once stood at its center. In its place, open ground allowed formations to assemble without reminder of that day's accusation. The nurse now worked within the signal verification office, her responsibilities formalized and expanded. She reviewed transmission logs daily, cross-checking timestamps against convoy movements, and maintaining a system that flagged irregular intervals automatically. The colonel, you're recently promoted to oversee logistics integrity across multiple units, visited the office during inspection rounds. He paused beside her desk, observing the updated verification chart pinned neatly along the wall. "The 9-minute rhythm is now built into detection software," she explained calmly. "If repetition occurs again, it triggers immediate review." He nodded. "Pattern awareness prevents repetition." Outside the window, trucks rolled through the gate in staggered intervals, the altered cadence now standard practice rather than emergency adjustment. Drivers no longer questioned uneven departure gaps. They understood the strategy behind it. Word of the silent square had traveled beyond the camp, not as spectacle, but as example. Officers in neighboring units adopted similar evidence. First protocols before public discipline measures were enforced. The colonel stepped toward the doorway, pausing briefly. "You understand," he said evenly, "that hesitation that day could have cost command standing." She looked up from the ledger. "And proceeding without proof could have cost lives." The statement required no further reply. The war continued, with new threats and new uncertainties. But that afternoon in the square had reshaped more than a single convoy's fate. It had recalibrated authority itself. As evening light filtered across the yard, soldiers moved with practiced confidence, no longer guided solely by rank, but by reinforced systems designed to catch deception before it escalated. The nurse closed a verified logbook and placed it in the outgoing file tray. Outside, the convoy engines faded into the distance, steady and unthreatened. The camp square remained quiet, not with tension, but with earned order. What had begun with forced kneeling before a restless crowd ended in a doctrine rooted in measured evidence. Discipline, they had learned, was strongest not when loud, but when grounded in truth. War exposes weakness, but it also reveals character. If this story moved you, subscribe to Clara at War for more WW2 mission dramas, where leadership is tested and truth decides the outcome. In war, silence can condemn, or it can protect the innocent.